Okay.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
My name is Nasia Anam, and I am assistant professor of English at University of Nevada, Reno, although that is about to change on July 1st, and I'll become associate.
Oh, wow! Congratulations,
Thank you.
promotion. Let's
Yes.
celebrate right here, right now. Now, in terms of celebration, I wanted to ask you that in your background, I can see white circular things, sort of little baubles hanging from the bookcases. Are they part of the celebration of becoming associate
No,
professor?
they're just like, I guess, um, judging from your accent, I'm gonna guess you would have called them fairy lights, but they're just little decorations, that's all.
Well, they're lovely. Have you got big plans for July the 1st? Are you going to have a huge party? Are you going to burrow underground with a pot of tea? What's the scoop?
I don't know. I mean, people keep asking me what to do. I've had two parties. I've had sort of I mean parties meaning parties of opinion, which is sort of like full of people who are say like, oh, it's super anticlimactic and actually have an existential crisis when you get tenure. And then the others who throw a big party, and I don't know which I belong to quite yet, so I'm trying to figure that out.
Well, my thing was, this is going back 30 years, of course. I found out in the middle of summer. So I lived in New York. No one was there.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I didn't have to worry about a party. Prof, I have a question that I pose to all my guests that I'd like to
Sure.
put to you, which is to inquire what's currently impeding, preoccupying, dynamizing, interesting you, apart from this massive dilemma of how to celebrate getting tenure. But that
Um,
might be your answer. Who knows?
Maybe that's yeah, that maybe all of the answer to all of those things. But I mean, unfortunately, the answer that I have today is a rather dismaying slash depressing one, which is the shooting that happened in San Diego. I don't know if you've heard of this at the largest mosque in San Diego of three people. And I'm just sort of really preoccupied by the spike in Islamophobia, and I don't necessarily like that word. I'll say more anti-Islamic sentiment that has grown and is being sort of exacerbated by American politicians, but I see it everywhere these days, and the fact that it's kind of culminated in this act of violence at a mosque where there was a school as well. So it's sort of like collapsing these concerns about gun violence, school shooting, anti-Islamic sentiment, the rise of kind of fractiousness in this particular country. These things are really concerning to me, and can be paralyzing, can be impeding, as you say,
Hmm.
but also are central to the work that I've, committed my life to doing. So, um, it is always strange to kind of have this current event occur and then think, well, this is pertinent to my research, but that's where I'm at right now.
Right. And of course, not that any life is more important than any other, but one of the people killed was a gentleman whose job was to protect the children in the school and who was seeking to do so
Exactly.
at the time of his assassination. And I take your point about this word phobia. I hate it when it's
Yeah.
used in these ways. And I think about it in terms of homophobia, because people may know that for many years in the United States, there is a defense for killing someone who's queer if you're a
Hmm.
man and who makes a pass at you. And the defense is literally homophobia. You
Right.
know, the person says, I'm afraid of gay men. He made a pass at me. I killed him. So I
Right.
hate it for that particular etymology, which is so grotesque. But in its case, and in the case of Islamophobia, although it may be that fear is a relevant part of the response to these things, there is also
Mhm.
hatred, ignorance, dislike, stupidity, violent tendencies. There are so many aspects to unpack. which can be just
Yeah.
as much ideological or cerebral as they are
Right.
psychological, right?
Right.
And as you say, they can be very much driven not by fear, but because there are leaders of opinion in the bourgeois media and in politics who are pushing exactly these kinds of in this case, Muslim sentiments. I don't know what you think about that. Talk some more about the Islamophobia problem.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think also part of what I object to is that it puts the focus or emphasis on the individual kind of person who's perceiving rather than talking about it as a systemic issue or sort of, as you're saying, an ideological issue. So if you think about it in terms of anti-Blackness or anti-Semitism, like that is about the phenomenon or the kind of like the 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 sentiment itself rather than the individual person who's feeling a certain way. And it's not necessarily about feelings per se. It's a sort of like it's a disposition or it's a stance. It's
Mhm.
not a kind of irrational fear that comes out of I don't know, like some kind of uh pathology. Like I don't like how it pathologizes the feeling of being
Well,
anti-Muslim as well, making it a psychological issue rather than a social or systemic issue.
yeah.
Mhm.
No, I think we're pretty much in accord on that one. It's a bit like for me, I mean, I'm appalled by particular words being used in particular ways at the moment. One is the word strike being
Uh-huh.
used to describe Israel attacking Lebanon or Israel and
Right.
ISIS attacking Iran. These are bombings, right?
Right.
The atomic bombs being dropped on Japan were not strikes, they were bombings. The British firebombing Dresden was a bombing. No one refers to the Blitz on London as a strike. So I'm
Right.
appalled by this word. And the other word is war. The war on drugs, the war on X, Y, and Z, right?
Yeah.
Wars are about killing people, raping people, and obtaining terrain. And so
Right.
I get very troubled with these metaphorizations that I think
Yeah.
denaturing the real meaning of these things. And in the case of strike, the way it's deployed today, euphemizing mass killing. Anyway,
Absolutely.
sorry, these are my current idée fixe. And this word strike is used every day by the
Yes.
BBC, the New York Times, All India Radio. I mean, you name it, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah, and I mean it connotes a kind of precision or I don't know, some kind of like meticulous or almost humane way of conducting warfare, which clearly precision is not of the utmost importance in these endeavors.
Now, getting on to your work, Prof.
Sure.
Um, I I don't know whether the book is out, but you've got a book when it comes out, Muslim
Hmm.
Heterotopias, Colonial Logics of Space in Literatures of Migration. And this
Hmm.
heterotopia idea is Foucauldian, I guess, in the way it's
Yes.
normally deployed. Could you
Right.
tell us a bit about that? And some of the authors that you look at include Zadie Smith, but also Michel Houellebecq and Salman
Yeah.
Rushdie. So
Yeah.
maybe not people that are conventionally included in writings about Islam and literature, let's say.
Oh, sure. Well, heterotopia, I mean, first of all, I will say like I may not be able to hang on to that title. I've been
Oh,
in conversation with the editors at Oxford where my book will be published, and they seem to want something a little more searchable. So I'm in debates about whether I get to keep my title, which I've grown quite attached to. But the question of heterotopia is an interesting one because, as you know, I'm sure you know, this term comes from a very short essay that comes from a talk that Foucault gave in 1962, which was translated into English in the early 80s in diacritics, but it's like it's almost impressionistic. There's so many openings and so many capacities for interpreting what that means. Heterotopia is, as he puts it, an enacted utopia. So it's a place that kind of like takes all of the elements in a particular social configuration and reconfigures them, restructures them, remixes them, and sort of changes the power dynamics therein. And so I'm very interested in this term as it relates to the the spatial configuration of the colony. And the colony is something he mentions at the very end of the essay. And specifically, he's talking at the end of the essay about colonies in the New World, missions, where there is this kind of like almost like perfect small scale recreation of European society, European culture, but obviously displaced into the new world, and so it signifies very differently. And I've been thinking a lot about the settler colony as a kind of model that is not just fixed in a particular geographic location, but the way that I'm kind of reconceiving is by thinking that the colony is a set of practices, spatial practices that could be mobile. And so in the book, I'm thinking about different configurations of space as they are represented in literature that kind of bring in certain spatial and power dynamics of the colony. So, and specifically in Britain, France, and the US. So, in I'm thinking about spaces like the immigrant enclave, the periphery between in France between the banlieue and the central city, the border checkpoint, the refugee encampment, and then the last chapter is about speculative dystopias. So kind of like inverting completely the idea of colonial utopia into like the dystopia of Europe being taken over by Muslim migrants. So it's all sort of centered around the question of Muslim migrants in Britain, France, and the US, and how the dynamics of the colony persist in spaces where Muslim migrants move and settle.
Wow. Wow. I'm reminded of the old Sri Lankan Marxist expression used in the UK very effectively. We are here because you were there.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's a kind of driving ethos of this project.
Beautiful, beautiful. And those liminal spaces you describe, the
Hmm.
space between the banlieue and the the metropolis, as it were.
Hmm.
That's also incredibly interesting, I think. These switching points, Foucault called them sometimes,
Yeah.
where all kinds of complicated interactions occur, and
Yes.
there are possibilities of change and so on. What do you see in some of these or in these authors who are very diverse, the ones you're looking at according to the list that I've got? What do you
Yeah.
see in common and what do you see that's different in the way they approach these questions?
Yeah. I mean, I think largely I am looking at representations of Muslim migrant spaces from the perspective of Muslims themselves. This is different for instance, my dystopia chapter, which looks at um, uh, Welbeck is in that chapter, and so that the book is Soumission or Submission, and that's specifically about like the speculative future that in which the Muslim Brotherhood has won the French elections and taken over. Um, but mostly, what I'm interested in is a kind of representation of Muslim spaces from the perspective of Muslim migrants who've moved to the metropole, and how all of these books that I look at, which include, as you mentioned in the first chapter, White Teeth by Zadie Smith, Brick Lane by Monica Ali, um, Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, all of, for instance, so I'll just take the first chapter as an example, where I look at the immigrant enclave. What I see is not only a kind of classic sort of question, like Bildungsroman question of sort of like how do we assimilate, how do we become part of like bourgeois European society, but also how do the dynamics of being colonized reiterate in the
Mm-hmm.
metropole.
Mm-hmm.
And um, and I don't just mean being colonized, I also mean like forming a colony of a new way of life. So the way that I'm thinking of the word colony is a bit dialectical. So not only is it sort of like the space of settlement, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also an outpost of a new social configuration. And so I'm trying to sort of like maybe like be a bit subversive in the way that I'm using the word colony. So if we think of the immigrant enclave as a colony, I think a lot of, conservative politicians would be in accordance and say like they're coming to invade, they're colonizing
Yeah,
us.
yeah.
But but in some ways it's also like, well, if we think about the utopian impulse behind colonization,
Mm-hmm.
it is forming a space where a completely new configuration of ways of life can arise. And I see that in each of these novels, where it is heterogeneous, it is ad hoc, it is places where solidarities can arise that were
Mm-hmm.
heretofore unprecedented. And it's also thinking outside of the nation state as well. So, if I move forward to another one of my chapters where I talk about refugee encampments and I look at uh, um, what do I look at Exit West, I look at uh, The Beekeeper of Aleppo, I look at Spring by Ali Smith. But thinking of the encampment or the detention center as a space that is about cordoning off and restricting and prohibiting movement, but also therein new configurations of social connection that are arising, and like thinking outside of the nation state, basically. What would it mean for there to be colonies of new ways of life that are not bound to empire, um, new solidarities and new possibilities arising within the kind of restrictive and confined space of the immigrant or the refugee encampment.
Gender's a pretty big theme in a number of these novels.
Hmm.
One that I found very compelling when I read it when it came out, which must be over 20 years ago, would be Brick Lane.
Hmm.
For those unfamiliar with Brick Lane, it's a part of East London where impoverished Jewish refugees lived in the 19th and early 20th centuries, not only refugees, but immigrants in general, and has become a place for, in particular, South Asian working class communities that have arrived in London at different points. This novel is about, at some level, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it is over 20 years since I read it, but at
Yeah.
some level, it's about a woman who moves from a very traditional form of finding a partner,
Hmm.
is matched to someone, moves to London to be with him, has all kinds of linguistic barriers, but also imposed restrictions on what a reader like me would see as her right as an individual to freedom of movement and
Hmm.
connection and so on. I wonder if you could correct my adumbration of the novel, but also tell us how it fits into the rubrics that you're
Yeah.
working with.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, and I don't think there's anything to correct in what you've presented just now, but I mean, the word refugee enters the English language from this very particular space in East London, because it's used to describe the French Huguenots who were refugees from France at the time, and then became like a kind of palimpsestic space that kind of housed different waves of refugees and
Mm.
migrants. It
Mhm.
was Eastern European Jews, and then it became Bangladeshis or Bengalis, and now, I mean, I think it's largely more of a hipster neighborhood than anything
Oh
else.
my God, is it? I spent a little while living in it, but that was 16 years ago, so I'm very out of date. But I can
Yeah.
imagine that speaking of colonization, hipster dipster colonization could easily have happened. And a thing to say about Britain is that when we say inner city in Britain, it doesn't have the same meaning as it does in the United States at all.
Sure.
Inner city means hipster, pretty much in the
Uh-huh.
yeah. So
Right. Yeah.
my God, we've moved in, we're taking it over, get out of the way. But please, we want your lovely food and your fun clothes and little shops.
Exactly. And it's so interesting because the Bangla language street signs are still present, and then they're like, positioned over like a like a cafe that serves like breakfast cereal. Ironically, I don't know. I mean, Serial Killer. I remember the name of this place, but so
A
just
terrible
thinking about
country. Why do I come from such a terrible place? Anyway,
oh,
sorry,
but it's
carry on.
wonderful. Uh, Brick Lane is such an interesting novel because it was published in 2003,
Right,
just after 9/11. And I imagine that the bulk of it was written before 9/11, although, I mean, I'm presuming. Um, uh, so in some sense, like we see it as at a kind of moment of transition between like what it meant to be a Bengali migrant in the UK pre 9/11, post 9/11. It changes very much. And it begins to change around the Rushdie affair, where being Asian in England starts to signify differently based on whether you're Muslim or not, because Muslim becomes a kind of problematic category in a way that it hadn't been pre Rushdie affair. And so those kind of class solidarities that arose in the 60s through 80s between different groups of post-colonial migrant um, communities kind of start to splinter after the Rushdie affair.
right,
And so
right,
you kind of see this in the diegesis of the narrative in the book, where you start to see the sort of like separating out of what does it mean to be Bangladeshi? Bangladeshi immigrants are largely Muslim versus being Asian versus being, generally like non-white
right.
or, part of Black Britain. Um, and the protagonist, um, I am very irresponsibly forgetting her name right now, but she's kind of in a love triangle between her kind of stodgy, traditional, almost sort of caricatured colonial subject husband, who's um, who's kind of like a sycophant of British culture, but like specifically kind of like 19th century British culture. He sort of like goes on these diatribes about Warren Hastings and and it's sort of an interesting foil to her lover, who's a more kind of radicalized British-born Bangladeshi Muslim who really identifies with a more global form of Islam rather than thinking of himself as specifically Bengali, specifically subcontinental, specifically Asian. He thinks of himself as Muslim. And she's kind of caught between these two visions of like what it is to be a post-colonial migrant in Britain. Um, and I think in the novel, she's kind of configured um, as a as a kind of space of negotiation, um, because obviously being an unassimilated colonial subject is not a a way of surviving in 21st century Britain, but neither, I think, according to the kind of like structure of the book, is her lover Kareem's way of becoming more and more radicalized. And so at the end of the novel, she starts a small business. Um, she becomes an entrepreneur, and it's like this kind of like I don't know that Monica Ali would agree with me in my assessment, but there is a kind of Thatcherite strain of sort of like, well, just be a capitalist. I think that's the way. And I think that's a remnant of the 20th century that I think maybe the book couldn't really take on fully the repercussions of the War on Terror and what that would mean for the community of Brick Lane at the time.
I think Nazneen was is the name of the
Nazanin, that's right.
yeah,
That's right. Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
A little bit of grotesque historical context. Until the 90s, South Asian women arriving in Britain for arranged marriages to British-based South Asians had virginity tests at the border conducted by the state to
I
prove
see.
that they were really there for an arranged marriage.
Uh-huh.
I
As
mean,
opposed to what would
well,
what else
quite,
would they
quite, as opposed to what? I mean, the huge mistrust and racism impelling British immigration policy is astonishing.
Right.
And yet it shouldn't be because it's absolutely ordinary. But that's just an
Yeah.
example of not what would have confronted her, but would have confronted a woman 15 years older, literally, coming
I
for an
believe.
arranged marriage.
Well, I mean, and what's interesting about that too is, I mean, if you go back and read the script of the Rivers of Blood speech, Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, what he in the 1960s was so concerned about was not necessarily the kind of the working class men who had come to Britain to work, but rather the women and children who were settling, forming communities, and that in and of itself was the greatest threat. And so I think the kind of gendered aspect of sort of like what is the most threatening, what is the most dangerous kind of immigrant from the former
Yes, has
colonies?
changed. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. By the way, Enoch Powell, a fun fact that probably some listeners won't know is that he was professor of classics and
Ah,
he did a famous translation of Horace published by Yale in the 90s. Uh,
uh,
but this guy, Enoch Powell, was a Conservative Party politician and then an Ulster Unionist politician in the UK. And in the early 60s, he gave his Rivers of Blood speech, which was echoed by Keir Starmer only a matter of months ago.
sure. Yeah.
Right. And this speech, this Rivers of Blood speech, the most racist in modern British history by a politician until Starmer.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Right.
Yeah, the sort of the afterlife of that speech is astonishing. Um,
Yeah.
and also just the echoes that I hear in contemporary US political rhetoric is also
Mm, mm,
astonishing.
mm. Yes, Powell was that rarity, a far right lunatic who was actually an intellectual
Yeah.
and clever. Um,
Yeah. A
very,
most dangerous combination.
you
Yeah.
bet. No, when the Second World War began, he was a professor of classics in Australia.
Oh, I see. I didn't know
He was
that.
there for 2 or 3 years. Yeah. So anyway, have a look next time you're looking at a Yale University Press catalog. See whether they're publishing a Horace translation and who the translator is, because I suspect in the US and literally my memory is that when it was translated, when it came out, I should say, probably after his death, it said Enoch Powell, former professor of classics,
Oh my
University
God.
of Sydney.
Wow.
Anyway,
Wow.
yes, that sort of attitude on the part of white British people, and not only to people of color, to the Irish as well,
Mhm.
enormously powerful and ongoing. Anyway, Prof, back to the book. So you've taken us through chapters 1 and 2. Are there any other particular chapters you'd like to highlight?
Sure. I
Remember, you
think
can't use the word heterotopia.
I cannot.
No, the publicists at Oxford will not have it. Just remember that. It's the H word. It's become the H word, Prof.
Yeah. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. They're just afraid of the term. Um, but the third chapter is on the kind of mobile and proliferating border checkpoint, particularly in the US context post 9/11. But I look at in that chapter, I look at the reluctant fundamentalist. I do look at home fire, so I'm also looking at sort of the way that the idea of the checkpoint proliferates in both Britain and the US simultaneously. Um, but this being a space of kind of interpolation and an
Hmm.
assessment of understanding Muslims as a particular kind of security threat, and that being assessed through um, representations of like grooming or clothing, sartorial and grooming features, or names, or like apps on phones, or accents, or sort of like even just like carrying a Quran around, this can be assessed as a security threat.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
I think um and also how the border becomes kind of dislodged from the geographical border between countries and then moves into every single international airport, and at this point in time um, is basically all public space. And this becomes more and more acute as time goes on. So at this point, I mean, the border is omnipresent and ambient. So I also look at Homeland Elegies by Ayed Akhtar and Bad Muslim Discount or Good Muslim Discount by Said Masood. So those are two books that came out in the 2020s, but specifically about sort of like how um, being a Muslim in the United States at this point means having kind of perforated citizenship, um, and being constantly almost like pushed into a state of paranoia of
Hmm.
being like the threat of being apprehended is around every single corner. And so the border becomes completely mobile and ambient.
Same if you commit the crime of speaking Spanish almost anywhere in the United States in public.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
a question about the refugee status. This term is being excised from the United
Hmm.
States government's vocabulary. It is literally ending that status.
Yeah.
At a universal level, it was adopted as a right after the Second World War and was really thought of in terms of, in inverted commas, what were called DPs or displaced persons, which
Right.
mostly meant white Europeans, although they might be
Right.
Romani or travelers, they might be Jewish. So they might be on the fringes of whiteness, as it were. But nevertheless, that was the concept that we work with still. Lots of folks, not only from the right, are calling for a complete revision of
Yeah.
declarations on the rights of refugees and a rethinking of it. Now, I know your purview's been literary historical here, but I wonder if you could help us think about that question more widely, right?
Yeah.
Of the refugee and the rights of the refugee and the responsibilities, of states today, especially when, of course, the vast majority of refugees go to other global South countries. You know, global
Yeah.
South countries bear this burden. I lived in Colombia when there were getting on for 2 million Venezuelans,
Yeah.
who were refugees. Now we get nothing like that in the global north. But can you give us a bit of a take on that one?
Well, let me see if I understand what you're asking. You're asking like about how the term in particular is being redefined or changed
Yes, but
in a
also, sorry, how the idea of having rights as a refugee is changing.
yeah,
They've been
yeah,
eviscerated in the United States. They're being diminished in many other wealthy countries. And people are talking about revisiting the UN's codification of this. So I'm wondering what should be refugee rights. Do you know what I mean?
yeah. Well, I mean, if we think about why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written after World War II, it had to do with rights for the stateless. Like rights were so tied to being a citizen of a particular nation state. And so how do we allot rights to those who have been excised from
Mhm.
specific nation states? And I think what's contingent, like human rights are contingent on there being states and there being statelessness. But the idea of the state has to be stable, right? Like I think part of what's happening now is that the entire idea of what, like the 19th century nation state as it were, with citizens who have particular rights and where there are constitutions and where there are democratic ideals. This in and of itself is a social configuration that is in crisis. So I think the idea of belonging to a state or being stateless is predicated on there being a stable concept of what a state is. And I feel like the notion of a democratic nation state in and of itself is up for question right now, from what I can tell, across the world. And so appealing to a different nation state for rights when in within that nation state, I mean, like, what does it mean to appeal for asylum and rights here in the United States, where I am, when its very citizens' rights have become entirely precarious?
Hmm. Hmm.
So, like I don't, yeah, like I was born in the U.S. I wasn't even a naturalized citizen, and I still worry right now about whether that is permanent or not. And so that I think that is a sign and signal that like the very concept of the nation state is crumbling. I think that that's maybe a very dire thing to say. But it is an experimental governmental form that hasn't existed for a very long time. So I wonder if it's at its sunset. And I don't know that that's actually an answer to the question that you're asking, but if we're asking the question of like, what does it mean to seek asylum? What does it mean to be a refugee? What does it mean to have human rights? All of that was established in the post-World War II order. And the post-World War II order was a time when we thought of the nation state as the kind of like inevitable um, political configuration that would organize the entire world. And I'm not sure that that's the case anymore.
I think you have answered the question wonderfully because you've expanded it so that the thought is not just about what do we do about the Universal Declaration, about the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, but rather, is the sovereign state really robust enough to continue at all, given that it is, in some sense, the responsible entity when it comes to taking on refugees? It does make me incredibly sad, I must say,
Yeah.
because one of the things you point out elsewhere in your work is the extraordinary increase in the number of refugees in so
Yes.
many parts of the world.
Right.
Um, Prof, can I move you on to what at least has been your title? I don't know if it
Uh-huh.
still is, because one of your very fascinating pieces is about forms of the global Anglophone, because
Yes.
you were created, as it were, as an assistant professor of global Anglophone and English literature. And
Yeah.
you were both confused and unhappy, I think, with this status. And I'm thinking back to how what used to be called English literature then became Commonwealth literature, it became world literature written in English, it became part of comparative literature, all
Mhm.
kinds of different associations in different moments, different conjunctures of literary studies. But now it's the global Anglophone. So did you work out what you were meant to do and did you like it? And will it change now that you're about to be an associate prof in a matter of weeks?
I mean, I will say I don't know what the future of that term is. I think it was contentious from the very beginning when it began to show up in particular in the language of hiring, um, the language of job listings. I think it became a more sort of I don't know, I think the scholarship that was produced around the term global Anglophone kind of sprang from or followed the terms of the market rather than the other way around. And so, in that sense, I wonder in some ways how much lasting power the term has because nobody's been really able to find a clear um, stable definition of the term, and not to say that the terms that preceded it, I mean, Commonwealth literature is a very specific thing, and like Commonwealth literature perhaps has to do with the Commonwealth, which has to do with Queen Elizabeth. But I think post-colonial is the term that would be the kind of proper predecessor to global Anglophone, and that was also always a contentious term. But I think at the same time, it had a clear sense of like temporal or political or geographic implications. And I'm not sure that that's the case with the global Anglophone. And I think in some ways, the global Anglophone exists to kind of defang the post-colonial or depoliticize it in some capacity because we're not talking about colonization and its aftermath when we're talking global Anglophone. It really broadens the term, and that can be beneficial, but I also think that that can de-radicalize it. And I'm very wary of that, particularly in this moment in time. And also, it takes out the kind of comparative aspect of post-colonial studies, which I think is very important. Because if we're limiting ourselves to the Anglophone, then we're not thinking about um, uh, all the other empires that exist besides the British Empire. I mean, you're sort of really limiting yourself to the British Empire and
Mm,
its
mm.
aftermath. And even though I'm in an English department now, and I do have a couple degrees in English, I did do my PhD in comparative literature. So I think comparison is very, very central to the way that I approach my research and the way that I think we should be doing ethical scholarship. And I think global Anglophone really kind of shirks that responsibility in some ways.
It gives also, in addition to this defanging, as you put it, a free pass to people who are English only speakers and readers because they can now look as though they're not provincial and parochial, and they are, in fact, moving elsewhere because they can be writing about literature from Kenya or Nigeria or India, right? That is
Right.
often written in English and
Yeah, absolutely.
so on. And they can write about Rushdie, who I think writes only in English, probably, or at least
Yeah.
principally. For
Yeah.
example,
Chutnified English, as he put it in the 80s.
at least he's got a sense of humor. I was listening the other day to a recent Desert Island Discs with him, this radio
Uh-huh.
program from Britain that's been going for decades. It's really worth listening to the podcast if you are interested, folks. The conceit is you take a famous person, you imagine they're exiled on a desert island and they can choose 8 pieces of music as a way of telling their story. Somehow or other, about 45,000 of his marriages got left out of his life narrative in in the discussion. It's all about daddy and advertising and the attack and so on. But anyway, uh, yes, I think there's something in what you say, though, as I say, I'm not an expert by any means. What about the relationship that has emerged between the post-colonial and the decolonial? I mean, here in Latin America, people, it's as if they've transitioned from post-colonial to decolonial as a term, in the same way as they transitioned from postmodern to globalization,
Hmm, hmm,
right?
hmm.
I mean, I remember going to a sociology conference, International Sociology Association in 2000, where the word global or the word globalization appeared in vast numbers of conference paper titles. And so I decided to look back to 1996, and I found that the same titles existed, except the word postmodern was used rather than global or globalization.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. That's so interesting. Um, I'm very interested in the tension between these two terms, decolonial and
Mm,
post. And
yeah.
I feel like there's a disciplinary tension as well. And this may have to do with, again, like, I mean, being very aware of the different histories of empire and decolonization that exist in the Americas versus the subcontinent in Africa and even I mean, to some degree, the Caribbean. But I think decolonial I find to be more mobilized in the context of Latin America and those scholars who are interested in questions of indigeneity in North America. Um, and it's a sort of like more ideological process. I think of post-colonial as kind of like on the ground connected to on the ground anti-colonial movements and nation formation. Whereas I think of decolonial, and am uh, I may be mistaken, but my sense of the decolonial is more of a sort of like ideological practice of kind of decoupling the hegemonic terms of colonization from the way that we think of knowledge ways and epistemologies. Um, and post-colonial is really sort of bound to histories and geographies. And again, I'm being very reductive, but I think that a lot of it boils down to like being very aware of the differences, for instance, between the way that the Americas were colonized and the way that the Spanish and Portuguese colonized versus the French and the British. Um, and the kind of decolonial or decolonization processes were very, very different in those cases too. And so I think it's an effort to kind of not conflate those histories and acknowledge that we have to kind of think of them very differently. Just because, like, what would it mean to like, what does anti-colonialism mean, for instance, in South America when there's centuries of mixture between cultures and I mean, like indigeneity means something so different in somewhere like Peru versus, I don't know, like Bangladesh, right? So I think we have to talk about it very differently.
Right. No, point taken. Uh, I, when I'm reading manuscripts that are sent for my evaluation in various tasks, and I read something called Asian theory, and I think, is Asian theory applying to a Hong Kong billionaire in a high rise equally to a Bangladeshi, who is sewing together footballs
Yeah,
to
yeah,
make money?
exactly.
Is that how is this? So there are some big problems with coagulating these vastly different societies under one rubric. At the same time, it can be a useful heuristic device, for
Yeah,
trying to ponder what is the genealogy of the way I'm thinking. One of like the way in which many people say, well, Latin America is part of the West. Hmm. Well, maybe, but it's, as you say, it's got this very different history from the rest of the world because the Spanish and the Portuguese, but also the French and the British, they
yeah,
had very different sexual policies of conquest, just a
yeah,
completely different model of gender. Anyway,
right.
enough of that. Prof, I want to give you the chance to add anything you may wish. It's been brilliant getting a chance to learn from you. And I didn't realize I'd be talking about Brick Lane and learning about Brick Lane from you. So thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add? It might be something that touches on terrain we've already covered, or it might be something that we haven't discussed.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe if I want to kind of gesture towards my book and the concerns that I have right now in the world, so being a person in the world these days, is just the question of sort of like why do we think of Muslim migration in places like Britain, France, and the US, but also a lot of Western Europe as an invasion? Like why is that the why is it the overarching rhetoric that's used to talk about Muslims from into the Western world? And I'm using Western in scare quotes, but I'm I, I'm struck by that language, and part of what drives me is to figure out like why why invasion is the term that's used, or why we think of like hordes or like swarms of Muslim migrants, and I don't know that we use those terms to talk about other waves of migration, particularly in Europe. And I think a lot of this has to do for me with the way that we think of the West and the formation of the West and how that has historically been defined against the Muslim world from its very beginnings. And so I'm trying to sort of like in my thinking, connect contemporary fear-mongering to early modern fear-mongering about, the Islamic empires. And so like that's what I've been concerned with lately. And so I don't know that that's anything I want to add or continue to talk about right now, but yeah, I think that that's kind of preoccupying my brain these days as I read the news every single day of sort of why does it sound like we're in the Crusades again?
It occupies you with every good reason. Thank you so much, Prof. It was really great learning from you. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much.